appreciate that. And hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Wygant, and as Sherry indicated, I'm at Eastern Kentucky University in Central Kentucky, which is supposed to be nice by this point in the year, but woke up to snow, so go figure. So we're going to spend an hour going over just kind of a broad overview of the MMPI-2-RF, talking about a little bit about how the test was developed, some of the major overview, aims and goals of the test, the scales, and I'll talk about some of the report options and hopefully have enough time to go over a case at the end to show how I utilize the RF in a forensic evaluation. Before I begin, I do want to disclose that I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, which is University of Minnesota Press, as well as the distributor of the test, Pearson Assessments, and receive research support from the press. So as I indicated, we're going to go over just a broad overview of the test, talk about the scales, hit on some of the documentation and standard procedures, and I'll give you some insights into the types of reports that you can use with the MMPI-2-RF. So the RF is a 338 item version of the MMPI-2, and it's been out now for 10 years, released back in August of 2008. The test was developed by Ben-Porath at Kent State and Anka Tellegen at the University of Minnesota, and includes a subset of the MMPI-2 item pool. So there were no new items that were written for the MMPI-2-RF. The norms were based on the norms that were developed and captured for the MMPI-2 back in the 80s, with one slight exception in that the MMPI-2 has gender-based norms. So you have T-scores for men and women separately, whereas the MMPI-2-RF has a non-gendered normative sample. So what happened is there were slightly more females in the normative sample than males. So essentially they took all of the male participants from the normative sample, which was 1,138, and then they took a random sample of 1,138 of the 1,462 females so that you'd have an equal number of males and females. And this was done because the Civil Rights Act of 1991, the updated Civil Rights Act, prohibits the use of gender-based norms in employment-related psychological evaluations. And the RF is used widely in both fitness for duty evaluations as well as pre-employment, typically with public safety types of professions like police and deputies and things like that. So the test is used widely in a variety of settings, obviously mental health settings that incorporate the test and diagnostic evaluations is probably where it's used the most, but it's used quite frequently in various medical settings for pre-surgical evaluations, lots of different types of forensic evaluations, and those public safety evaluations as well. The test has been widely researched at this point, and this is probably even outdated. Might need to update this, where there's been well over 300 peer-reviewed publications on the MMPI-2-RF. In a lot of ways, it was not that difficult to get this level of research up quickly because you could essentially take old MMPI data sets and rescore them as MMPI-2-RF data sets. And so we were able to get a lot of research going on this test pretty quickly. And these studies cover a variety of settings and topics. So, validity scales, the use in all these different types of settings. And what that allows you to have is some confidence that there's a great deal of external validation that speak to the construct validity of the scales on this test. And that becomes very important in certain settings like forensic evaluations where your test interpretations may be challenged or certainly open to scrutiny in the adversarial justice system. So let's talk a little bit about the scales on the RF. I'm just going to give kind of an overview of all of them. So there's 51 scales on the test that break into 9 validity scales, and the remaining scales cover various aspects of clinical functioning and personality. Now, they're arranged in a hierarchical fashion, starting with the higher order scales, which provide broad overview of the person's functioning, The RC scales are kind of a more mid-tier range, and then you have these very narrowly focused scales called specific problem scales that are focused on these different content areas that can capture more, specific functioning. There's 2 interest scales and then revised versions of the Psi-5 scales, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the validity scales on the RF are going to look pretty similar to most people who are familiar with the MMPI-2. There's a lot of overlap, and actually the revised versions of these scales are denoted with this -R. So for most of them, you see the -R, which just simply means that this was a revised version of the MMPI-2 validity scale that's consistent with it. So these first 2, VRIN-r and TRIN-r, are used to detect random and fixed responding, so with more broadly non-content-based invalid responding. So detecting when people aren't paying attention or randomly responding or responding in an inconsistent fashion by responding true, predominantly true or false, irrespective of the content of the item. The next 5 scales look at various threats to over-reporting. And a unique feature of the RF in relation to even the MMPI-2 is that you cover now over-reporting across different domains of functioning. So these first 2, FR and FPR, really focus on over-reporting of emotional and psychological symptoms, with FR really being kind of similar in a lot of ways to F and even FB on the MMPI-2. FPR is that more specific scale that looks at over-reporting of severe psychopathology. So these are items that were rarely endorsed not only in normative sample but also in psychiatric samples. So it makes these items much more specific to over-reporting. FS was a scale that I actually worked on with Yossi Ben-Porath and Paul Arbisi, and this is a measure of over-reporting of somatic responses. So these were items that were rarely endorsed in medical and chronic pain samples, and yet they include items that describe physical malfunctioning. So you'll see individuals who are more, purposefully trying to present themselves as overly physically impaired, perhaps endorsing these items, which comes into play in evaluations of disability, personal injury, and those types of settings and questions. FBSR, symptom validity, is a revised version of the old fake bad scale, renamed the symptom validity scale, which captures kind of non-credible somatic and cognitive complaints. Another scale that's new to the RF is the response bias scale, which is an empirically developed scale that identified items that were associated with people either passing or failing cognitive malingering measures like the TOM, the word memory test. And so what these items basically tell you is that the person's responding in a way that tends to be associated with malingered memory complaints. And so if you're in let's say a forensic neuropsych setting, that might be more applicable and might trigger you to take a more in-depth look at that. The 2 remaining scales are the underreporting scales, and they're going to be familiar to you if you know the MMPI and MMPI-2. So they're just revised versions of L and K. One of the things that happened in the development of the RF was a move away from inferential titles for the scales to a more descriptive, title. And you see this, probably the best example on the entire test is L, which, as you may recall, used to be called the lie scale, which was a pejorative and not really accurate title. You couldn't really use the scale to determine whether someone's lying. Essentially what L always did was identify when people are espousing uncommon virtues or rarely claimed moral attributes, and people not really identifying weaknesses that many people are willing to acknowledge. So that's really what the scale captures. The KR scale, like K, is really associated with underreporting when people are trying to present themselves as extremely well adjusted. So it kind of captures that aspect of underreporting. Moving into the more clinically substantive scales, you have, again, these 3 higher order scales, starting with emotional internalizing dysfunction, which really just captures at the broadest level, the notion that this person's experiencing problems with mood and affect. So this is going to trigger you to consider things like mood and anxiety disorders. The next one is thought dysfunction, which basically is associated with disordered thinking, psychosis, delusions, those sorts of things. And behavioral externalizing dysfunction identifies kind of poor impulse control, a tendency to act out in an under-controlled manner, really kind of alerts you to things like conduct-related problems, antisocial types of issues. Now, the RC scales, the Restructured Clinical scales, were originally released in 2003, and they were an attempt to identify a solution to a problem that long plagued the clinical scales from the original MMPI, which was that they had poor discriminant validity, had high levels of intercorrelations that were attributable in a large part to there being this saturation with general emotional distress. So without getting into all the specifics of how the scales were developed, essentially what the authors of these scales did was remove this demoralization component from all of the clinical scales and put it onto a single scale, because it's still an important construct to measure. So you have this scale called demoralization, which captures general, unhappiness, dissatisfaction with life. And then the remaining RC scales are essentially what was left from their parent scale when you remove demoralization and some other, underlying components. So they become a more pure measure of what the original clinical scale was trying to get at. So you have a scale called RC1 that captures diffuse, physical health problems and somatic complaints. RC2 captures anhedonia and lack of positive emotional responsiveness. Scale 3, the hysteria scale, was kind of a complex scale in that it had not only, aspects of demoralization, but as you may recall, lots of somatic complaints. And of course, they already captured those with RC1, so they didn't want to repeat that. So there was a factor in hysteria that was naivete, it's kind of naive orientation. And essentially what the authors of the RC scales did is they just reverse coded those items so that higher scores are reflective of cynicism, kind of a non-self-referential belief that others can't be trusted, low opinion of other people. RC4 captures antisocial behaviors in a much more pure way than the former PD scale. There's no RC5 and RC0. I'll talk about those a little bit later, so just keep that in mind. RC6 captures kind of ideas of persecution, self-referential beliefs that others pose a threat. It includes items like, people are trying to get me, people are trying to poison me, people are out to get me, and those sorts of things. RC7 captures a broad array of maladaptive anxiety and negative emotional experiences like anger and irritability. RC8, in a much more pure fashion than the schizophrenia scale, scale 8 on the clinical scales, captures, specific types of aberrant experiences, delusions, hallucinations, those sorts of things. And then finally, RC9, hypomanic activation, captures things like grandiosity, impulsivity, aggression, and those more manic-like symptoms. I do want to note before I move on that the RC scales that were originally released in the MMPI-2 are the exact same scales in the RF, so basically the same. Moving into the specific problem scales, we have scales that are capturing different aspects of somatic and cognitive functioning. So you have a scale called malaise that captures kind of that general dissatisfaction with one's overall physical health or kind of feelings of debilitation. In a lot of ways, I almost liken this to like a somatic demoralization scale. It's like feeling crappy, feeling bad because you're not feeling well. Then you have several scales like gastrointestinal complaints, head pain complaints, and neurological complaints, and cognitive complaints that capture just different types of cognitive and physical issues. And the titles are pretty clear in what they're capturing. So, nausea for gastrointestinal complaints, pain issues for head pain complaints, dizziness and weakness paralysis for neurological complaints, and memory and attention problems for cognitive complaints. There's a set of internalizing specific problem scales, and the first 4 really deal with aspects of demoralization. So you have SUI, which is a collection of those items that talk about suicidal thoughts and ideation. You have this concept that Beck talked a lot about called helplessness and hopelessness, kind of capturing the idea that you can't reach your goals or problems are insurmountable, things like that. You have items that talk about self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, low self-esteem, feeling useless. And then finally, items that talk about inefficacy. So basically that you can't make decisions, you feel inefficacious, indecisive, those sorts of things. There's also 5 scales that capture elements of more RC7, negative emotionality. Starting with stress and worry, kind of the idea that you're stressed out, you're preoccupied, you're worried about different things. Anxiety scale captures much more of that pervasive, frightful type of anxiety that you see a lot with panic issues. And there's also a couple studies that have shown that the anxiety the anxiety scale is the best marker of PTSD on the MMPI-2-RF. You have a scale called anger proneness, which captures, like it says, a proneness to experience anger and irritability. And then you have the 2 fear scales. Behavioral restricting fears is kind of like, because I have all these fears, it inhibits my normal behavior. So this is a scale that's going to be associated with things like agoraphobia. And then you have all of the collection of fears items on this scale called multiple specific fears. So fears of, the sight of blood frightens me, I think is one of the items, fear of fire, thunder, those sorts of things. The externalizing specific problem scales break into 2 that kind of capture RC4 elements, like juvenile conduct issues and substance abuse, and those that capture more elements of RC9, so aggression and activation. I'll say with this, these 4 scales, they really do break down into kind of more externalizing issues, whether they're more criminalistic issues versus substance abuse versus the proneness to engage in physical aggression. And then the last one, activation, is really what's left over, which are kind of, more the manic-like symptoms. You have 5 different types of interpersonal scales, so those items that reference conflictual family issues. A scale that captures a tendency to be passive and unassertive, submissive, and at the low end, kind of capturing more dominance, interpersonal dominance. You have a scale that looks at social avoidance, so either avoiding or not enjoying social events. And then that personality trait of shyness, kind of being bashful, inhibited when around others. And I think the last scale, disaffiliative, is actually the most interesting. It's elevated for a variety of reasons. Essentially, the items are talking about not liking to be around people, but I've seen this scale play kind of a conceptual role in different types of disorders, like schizoid types of issues, even psychopathy assessments where individuals are basically saying that they don't like people, kind of alienated from others. But you'll also see it with people who have avoidant personality, autism, if the person's able to take the test. So it can be elevated for lots of reasons, and often provides interesting clinical correlates. Now, I said earlier that scale 5 was not restructured. That was the masculinity-femininity scale. Essentially, what the authors of the RF did was revise it by capturing the items that discuss aesthetic literary interests, so items like I'd like to work as a librarian, and then those items that capture more mechanical physical interests. So the first item on the test, I like mechanics magazines. Everyone, I apologize. My university had this testing of the broadcast emergency system, so my computer may have clicked out for a second. Hopefully I'm back on. This happens every Wednesday, or one Wednesday a month, which tends to be the Wednesday at noon when I do the RF webinars. So I think this is the third or fourth time it's happened. Okay, rounding out the RF scales are the Psi-5 scales that were originally released for the MMPI-2. These are scales that capture dimensional maladaptive personality traits that align conceptually with the new alternative model of personality disorders that was released in DSM-5, put in Section 3 for future study. So you have these scales that capture maladaptive personality, like aggressiveness, kind of instrumental, instrumental aggression. Psychoticism is kind of a proneness to disconnect from reality, capturing things like schizotypal and schizoid personality issues, and at the high end, perhaps even psychotic symptoms. Disconstraint is kind of an overall disinhibition, poor impulse control scale. And then the last two are the more emotion-based markers. So you have the negative emotions, neuroticism, negative emotionality, and then introversion, low positive emotionality. So that's a snapshot of all 51 scales. Let's talk a little bit about how you use the measure in terms of the manuals and the procedures. So the manuals for the RF include these three. You have the blue scoring and administration manual, the green technical manual, and then I guess it's orange manual that talks about the user guides for reports. The green manual, what's kind of neat about the RF is that in a lot of test manuals, they end up being really thick because they combine all of the psychometric properties with the interpretive stuff. The RF breaks them out. So most clinicians and people who are using the test really just rely on that blue manual, which I'll talk about later. But all of the correlations and the psychometrics and all that stuff is in this green technical manual. It provides a brief introduction to the test, talks about how the scales were developed, and then provides some of the psychometric properties, things that you would normally see in most test manuals. So information about reliability and validity, correlations between all of the MMPI-2 scales and all of the RF scales in a variety of settings, and then intercorrelations among all of the RF scales. The book is primarily appendices. I think appendices probably make up at least 3/4 of that thick technical manual, and most of them focus on external correlates. So there were lots of correlations, almost 54,000 correlations that were calculated around these 6,000 people and these 605 criteria in all of these different types of settings. And these are including things like, record review data, diagnostic impressions, other external correlates, other psychological measures. And these correlations really served as the basis for the interpretive statements in the MMPI-2-RF manual. You also have, in addition to the external correlates, tables that talk about, converting raw scores to T-scores, comparability of the norms between the RF and MMPI-2. So do you get the same profile of the MMPI-2-RF if you administer it from the MMPI-2-RF booklet, or if you convert it from an MMPI-2 administration? And the answer is yes. You get essentially the same profile. And then you also have data on all these comparison groups totaling 65,000 cases. This is a list of all these different groups, and I'm going to come back to this because there's a really neat feature of the test that incorporates these groups. But essentially, what you have in this manual is means and standard deviations on all 51 scales across all of these different types of groups. So the normative group, different types of psychological and psychiatric treatment groups, sexual addiction treatment groups, sex offender groups, forensic correctional groups, medical groups, college groups, lots of groups. And this is what you see in the technical manual. Again, you see the means and standard deviations for all the scales. But we're going to come back to this in a little bit. I'll show you how you can use this in your interpretation. What else do you have here? You have comparison group data. Okay, I just talked about that. And then correlations, again, between all the RF and MMPI-2 scales. Now, the blue manual is the administration, scoring, and interpretation manual. It's really what you're going to be using most when you conduct an MMPI-2-RF administration. Again, it introduces the test, provides all the standard stuff about intended uses, qualifications, and protection of test materials. I will say, as a forensic psychologist, I was recently asked to turn over all MMPI-2-RF materials in a case I was in. And this manual includes some really helpful language for how to deal with that. Pearson's lawyers basically provide some, language that you can include if someone's trying to get copy protected and secure test materials. I found that very helpful. There's also a section on the norms and standard procedures for administering and scoring the test. Obviously, you want to assess the testability of the evaluee. Reading level tends to be around 4 or 5 grade reading level. You want to, obviously use the standard administration and response recording modalities, which include, booklet and answer sheet, audio CD, if reading's an issue, and then you can also administer the test on screen using QLocal or QGlobal. And obviously, you want to supervise testing. You never want to send home an MMPI-2 booklet and items to bring back to the office. The scoring procedures include QLocal, which is the computer-based, and then QGlobal is the web-based, cloud-based scoring. You can also mail in scoring, and that will give you either the kind of score report, has all the basic scores, or the interpretive report. You can also convert an MMPI-2 into an RF using either QLocal, QGlobal, or mail-in. And then, of course, the old tried and true hand scoring templates and profile sheets. Okay, and then the last thing in Chapter 5 of the administration manual is the test interpretation, which is pretty straightforward. There are really excellent tables on what you can say about each of the scales at each of the levels, so it's fairly straightforward in terms of interpreting. The appendices for the interpretive manual include the T-score conversion tables, scoring keys for all the scales, scale membership of all the items. Itometric data is the reading level, which again in Flesch-Kincaid reading level tends to, I think, be around 4 or 4.5 grade level. And then item conversion tables, depending if you're looking at the MMPI or MMPI-2 or RF. Finally, the kind of orangish manual, I'll call it orange, looks orange to me, provides some information about the user guides to the different reports. So the standard report, which I'm going to show you, is called the MMPI-2-RF score report. This is what it looks like. You have the basic title sheet, page 1. And then you have the validity scales. Just to orient you a little bit, you have these little dash marks at the top and bottom. Those are the floor and ceilings for each scale. The validity scales for the RF only have that line at 50. If you remember, the MMPI-2 also has it at 65. But we know that we don't really interpret some of these over-reporting scales at 65, so it just kind of gets in the way. The raw scores, the T-scores, the response rate cannot say how many items they leave blank. And then at the bottom of each page, you're going to see, abbreviations and full-scale titles. Moving into the clinically substantive scales, you see the higher order scales here, followed by the RC scales. You then see the specific problem scales, starting with the somatic cognitive, and then the internalizing, externalizing, interpersonal, and interest scales, and then the Psi-5 scales. Now, another way of representing the entire profile is to not organize it by scale set, specific problem, RC, higher order, Psi-5, but rather domain. And so every profile score report has this full, score sheet, which basically shows all 51 scales at the same time, but it just breaks it down into these are the scales that measure content non-responsiveness, over and under reporting. These are all the scales that look at somatic issues, emotional dysfunction, thought dysfunction, behavioral dysfunction, interpersonal functioning, and interests. So you can get a snapshot, and it kind of already organizes it. And I'm not going to go into the interpretive strategy at all today, but Yossi Ben-Porath has in the book and also in the manual a very clear interpretive strategy that focuses on interpreting the scales by their domains rather than their scale sets. You also see the item level data. So these are the 2 items that the person left blank. Then you also have some critical responses. So these are things like, had the person endorsing the suicidal items, items on anxiety, ideas of persecution, and aberrant experiences are also reported here. You can also designate if you want to see the items on certain scales. So, you're not going to get this automatically, but you can set it up so that, let's say I want to see all of the items on somatic complaints and neurological complaints because I want to follow up and query any of those types of items. You can designate that here in the report. Now, earlier I said we have all these comparison groups, right? You remember showing this slide. Really neat feature is that you can compare, you can select any one of these and plot it against your client's MMPI. So this is the same case. This is no comparison group selected. If we select, in this case, the psychiatric inpatient community hospital men, we have 600 and looks like 59, 69, something like that. And what you're getting is the same black line. So this is still your client here, but then you get this darker or lighter gray dashed line, which shows the mean score in that comparison group, and then plus and minus 1 standard deviation. That's the bar. And what that allows you to do is really put some context into your interpretation based on, maybe the similar, maybe you administered the test in a similar context. And just to illustrate this, let's say you have a case where you have this FR of 83. You want to know, is that common in this type of area or this type of setting? So if you're in an inpatient hospital, you'll see that, yeah, it's slightly over the mean in relation to this comparison group, but not really. Now, if we were to select one of those law enforcement candidate comparison groups, you're going to find that the mean is like way down here. And so then this score looks really out of place, okay? So it just provides a little context. You're still interpreting the profile that the client produced. Another neat feature of the test is that you can create your own comparison groups. Let's say you're in you have a practice or a setting that has maybe a unique type of client. As long as you have 200 valid cases, you can develop your own. So this would be, you can name it what you want. Here it's just called Custom Comparison Group X. And you can see how these scores compare. You also get the percentile at the bottom. I didn't mention that earlier. So you can kind of see what percentile your client's score is in relation to the comparison group. We also have the interpretive report that's available. And essentially what it does is it gives you an algorithm that scores the test and interprets it. The neat feature, though, is that, it does it in a pretty straightforward manner, and you can actually see what is prompting all of these statements. I'm going to point that out in a second. So the interpretive report includes a synopsis, covers all the protocol validities, all those validity scales, and then gets into the substantive scales, again, breaking it down based on those areas of functioning: somatic, emotional, thoughts, behavioral, interpersonal. So here's what I'm talking about. If you notice right here, behind these statements are superscripts. And those superscripts are shown later on here. So you can actually see which scale is elevated that prompted that particular statement. And if you have the PDF of the report open, you just hover your your mouse over that, it'll actually just pop up on the screen. The other thing that's kind of neat is you see this word reference. You see it throughout here. It also provides a list of research references that support that interpretive statement. So these are peer-reviewed journal articles that point out, that support those interpretive statements. So it's just another, level of empirical foundation to the test. Okay, so the interpretive report does not alter the interpretation, whether you do it standard or custom comparison groups as well. So you can also put that involved as well. And then there also is a police candidate interpretive report, which was developed by David Corey and Yossi Ben-Porath. And this one actually includes a focus on using the test in law enforcement pre-employment settings. So it's really geared for that. And I'm also aware of a very new product that's, I think, out, but maybe coming out very shortly, called the interpretive report for back patients or, spinal cord stimulator implant surgical evaluations, developed by Andrew Block and Yossi Ben-Porath. So stay tuned for that if you're working in a health setting as well. So I want to end with a case example, and then we'll have time for questions. So I want to show you guys how I use the test, and this is a case that I worked on about a year ago, a lawsuit, civil lawsuit case, in which the plaintiff, who I evaluated in this case, and I was retained by the plaintiff's counsel, is a 47-year-old Caucasian woman who was evaluated to determine if she had PTSD as a result of witnessing her husband who had been killed by a train. So I gave her the MMPI-2-RF as part of my overall psychological evaluation. And so looking at the validity scales, you can see she answered all of the questions, really no indications of, non-content-based invalid responding. She responded in a consistent manner. When you look at these over-reporting scales, you might wonder, is she malingering? Is she feigning? Is she exaggerating? Well, I don't think so. The scores are, they're not low, but they're certainly not in that level. Usually people with PTSD, it's not uncommon for them to have scores even in the hundreds. So I felt pretty good about this with these two scores. And then this more somatic cognitive scores, I didn't think were as really relevant in this case because she wasn't claiming any physical health impairments as a result of the lawsuit. I also gave her the SIRS and some other feigning instruments, and she passed all of them. And we also see that we don't have any evidence of underreporting in this case.